This believes I'm streaming. And it looks like we are on the air. Hi, I'm Greg Salmieri. This is the third episode of the Atlas Project. The Atlas Project is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group on Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged. And the way it works is my colleague Ben Bayer and I post questions by Thursday in the week about the chapter that we're going to be reading. This week it's Chapter 3 of Part 1, the top and the bottom, and a lot of discussion happens online in response to those questions. We look over that discussion, see what topics seem to be of general interest, and we filter the best of it into our plans for leading a live discussion on Tuesday nights. Typically, I'm here in New York leading a discussion with the group here, which you can see. And we have to teleconference Ben in from New Orleans, where he's got a group of people. But we're very fortunate enough, and it's New Orleans' loss, to have him here with us in person tonight. Note we're at a new time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 4 o'clock for people on the West Coast. And what is it? I forget what time it is if you're in...
4 Pacific.
No, 4 Pacific, but what is it if you're in London or Gap? Or
11 UTC. 11
UTC. Okay. And links to all the information you need about this, a schedule of readings, policies that tell you, not to be rude or give spoilers or talk about things unrelated to the novel. All of that stuff can be found at atlasproject.live, along with links to the most recent questions. Ben, you want to talk about how the discussion tonight's going to go?
Yeah, so we're going to try to run this in the same way that we did last time, even though we had some technical problems doing this last time. As we've mentioned before, we're making a special effort to get feedback from and interact with first-time readers of the novel. And so when we are asking questions of the audience, we may start by talking to people in our live classrooms, but whether we're doing that or not, we want to give preference to first-time readers. And so especially if you're online, please preface any comment you make with FTR if you are a first-time reader. And one last word of caution, remember that the more people who comment, the faster the comments go by on the Facebook Live feed, and the harder it is for us to follow them. But we want to be able to follow them because we want live commenters. And so the rule of thumb that we've come up with is, if you just want to react to something, say, you like something or hate something, please use the Facebook buttons, the reaction buttons for that purpose. You should try to reserve comments for things that you would say if you were going to raise your hand in a normal classroom, and whether it's a comment or a question, substantive enough to try to warrant our attention. And that way, hopefully, we'll be able to keep track of the comments a little bit better. And so far, nobody has written a comment, that we have a lot of people reacting. So that's a good way to start things off, since we haven't said anything to ask questions about yet. And since I'm the representative of the Ayn Rand Institute, I thought I would mention one last announcement. For anybody who's in the New York area, the Institute is sponsoring Atlas Shrugged Revolution Dinner on September 28th. And there's a number of events associated with that as well that people who are reading this book might be interested in attending. If you want to find more about that, please check out aynrand.org/NYC. So with that, I think we're ready to get started. And we decided that we were going to start off tonight by going mostly in chronological order of the chapter, with a few exceptions. And so we'll start off by talking about the beginning, where we see a number of surly characters gathered at the top of a skyscraper in a bar, which nonetheless looks like a cellar, which is an interesting way of describing it. That's something we might come back to talking about later. But one of the questions that we posted online was about what decision was being made in this meeting especially between James Taggart and Orrin Boyle, and there's a number of other characters gathered in on this scene. This is an interesting question to ask, I think, because it's not immediately obvious whether a decision is made, and especially what the decision actually is. And you have to read between the lines to figure it out. And we did have a lot of discussion about this in the online group on Facebook. And a number of people realized, first of all, there was a decision being made. And I think did a pretty good job figuring out the outline of probably what decision was being made, but it's worth, I think, reiterating a few of the details about that, especially because it's true that the decision isn't named. They don't write out a contract and shake hands on it. So this is one of the number of cases in this novel where there are hints planted, and you have to pick up the clues and kind of deduce what's going on from the clues. It's a mystery story after all. So what I think I'll do is I'll list a few of the clues to start off with, and then I'm going to open it up to a little bit more discussion about what exactly was agreed to, even though there was, I think, good feedback on this on the group. So here's some things that we know about the two main characters at the beginning. We have Orrin Boyle, we have James Taggart. Some things we know about Boyle. We know that his steel mill can't get ore, and he's complaining about this fact. He doesn't like how Reardon is using his ore to make this experimental metal, Reardon metal. He complains about destructive monopolies. He thinks there need to be national policies that give people a fair share of the ore. We presume he would be included in that. And he also thinks, by the way, that private property is justified only to the extent that it helps serve the public. So you have to kind of gather these different things that Boyle says throughout the first scene, but if you put them all together, that's what it amounts to. Then Taggart, we know he starts by complaining about disunity and unbridled competition threatening the public interest, and especially objects to upstart railroads who duplicate services and territories with established companies. He doesn't mention any company in particular, but it's a pretty good bet from previous chapters that he's talking about the Phoenix Durango, which is competing with him in Colorado. So let's open this up, and I want to start. I guess we can start with the room here in particular. What does it sound like Boyle wants to do, based on what this number of clues we've been able to collect? And if you have thoughts online too, please, especially if you're a first-time reader, please jot a few of them down. So what is Boyle trying to do or trying to get done for him? And he kind of describes the general kinds of policies that he advocates, and we're expected to see that he wants those applied perhaps in a particular way. Maybe in his case, he thinks national policy should give people a fair share of the ore. He complains about destructive monopolies. Al?
And businesses should share the burdens.
He says that too, yeah. And what would that amount to in particular?
Well,
what kind of concrete policy proposals is he probably gaming for here?
that if a better run business is doing better than a poorly run business, some force has to come in and equalize it.
Okay, well, which business is he probably talking about here? I mean, he doesn't say it.
Or.
But
The ore.
Reardon owns his own ore.
Reardon owns his own ore.
Which then can be funneled into Reardon metal.
Yeah. So one of the interesting, kind of economic facts about the way that Reardon does his business is what they call vertical integration. He makes steel, but there's a lot of inputs that you need to make steel, and rather than just relying on other ore miners to sell it to him, apparently they've been unreliable and he hasn't been able to guarantee the supply well enough. He buys the ore mines. He mines the ore for himself. And so, Al, I think what you're suggesting is that if Reardon is in charge of this ore mine and he's got all this allegedly monopolistic power, what Boyle would like is to see that broken up, and which means what in practice? Something like antitrust laws. Yeah, I mean, and typically, historically, antitrust has been used against vertical integration. The idea is that, this was famously used against the Standard Oil Company, for example. So they want to break up Reardon's control of the ore mines. Do you want to?
Go ahead.
So you're focusing on national policy, but Boyle also says the National Council of Metal Industries passed a resolution to appoint a committee to study the question of Reardon metal, quote unquote. So I assume that's an NGO, but public opinion is often swayed by these national councils. So he's doing a two-pronged attack, maybe. by trying to show that Reardon metal is worthless, but Reardon ore we can take. So maybe something like that.
Well, so one of the things that he's mentioned is that he thinks that the ore that Reardon's mining, he's using it for Reardon metal, and he thinks this is a wasteful experiment when other people like him need to be instead just making regular steel.
Yeah, there's one element of this also that's, I think, worth noting in how Boyle describes it. So he describes it as there's a national emergency, that there's a shortage of ore. As though the normal state of affairs was there was plenty of ore. But something's happened that all the ore mines have stopped being reliable. And it just so happens that this one guy, Reardon, has the mine that's reliable. And
it's just good luck.
It's just his good luck, and it's therefore not fair that he should be the one to profit from it. He's got a corner on God's own resources. So from Boyle's perspective, the ore is just there for people. Somehow it's got, Reardon didn't build it. Somehow it's got unfairly set up into a situation where Reardon's got the only good mine. Now, we don't know, in fact, what's going on in the ore situation. But I think we have indications that that's probably not the author's view of things. And the fact that Reardon's the only steel company that owns an ore mine shows that he's kind of concerned about this kind of thing in a way that Boyle isn't until he finds himself without ore.
One more thing about what Boyle wants done. So we get the suggestion here that he wants this monopolistic control that Reardon has over his own ore mines broken up. How's that going to happen? How's this policy going to get implemented? We get one big hint.
They have to use all their Washington friends.
So Washington ability is involved here, and so who's he speaking to when he says this? Whose Washington ability in particular is Boyle relying on?
Taggart, because that was mentioned as one of his qualifications to be president of a railroad.
Yeah, so Taggart is I guess noteworthy in this novel for having this Washington ability, and he speaks openly of having friends in Washington and that he might speak to them. He doesn't think ordinarily there's enough political capital to get some kind of antitrust action carried out against Reardon. Reardon's got his Washington men too, but maybe Taggart will speak with somebody, and we'll maybe talk a little more about that later too. Okay,
Is this an occasion maybe to talk about the another aspect of the scene that people mentioned online, which was Jim's sort of attitude towards the bar that he's at? This liquor is swill, I hate that bartender, and so forth. So what is conveyed by that? I think a couple of things are, but do you guys have any thoughts here?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, what struck me was the chapter is called The Top and the Bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts off with lots of hints that the top and the bottom have been inverted.
Mm-hmm.
They're really up on the upper floor of a skyscraper, but it's carefully made to look like a cellar dive.
Yeah, and
the bartender is supposed to be obsequious toward his customers, but he doesn't even bother to hide his contempt for them.
Okay, because I was going to ask, we also, at the end of the chapter, see someplace that's at a bottom that looks like the top. So I think we'll talk later maybe more about this inversion, but I was wondering how you were connecting it to Jim's manner, and it was that, so you're in a certain way sympathizing with Jim. The bartender is giving him poor service, hiding his, maybe he deserves the contempt, but anyway, you wouldn't expect the bartender to show contempt, and he does.
And it isn't lost on him, because he says, I wish they'd fire that bartender.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if the bartender's, he acts like a kind of servant to men's vices, and, but he doesn't do anything as rude as what Jim's doing, and Jim's not just being rude to the bartender, right? I mean, is Jim doing anything else rude there?
He edges out his friends from the table. It's a small table.
Yeah, it's a small table, and
taking it over and doesn't care that they're uncomfortable. Yeah. So he's just contemptuous.
It says they don't question his privilege. He's like the original, that stupid new neologism, man-spreader. But this man-spreader also. It's in if you're on the subway and you take up too much room. Yeah. So Jim's doing this in the table. I think that's an invalid concept, incidentally. But anyway, it is rude to take up too much space when there are people around you, I say with my equipment crowding banner. Anyway, yeah, so he's rude to his friends, too, or the people he's with. And one of his moments in being rude at the bar, do you have the page for it, near the page for this? Listen to look at what happens.
46.
So well, if you've got to, yeah. So he's been complaining about the drinks and so forth. Taggart, Boyle is going on about the natural resources, the iron ore. We don't have enough iron ore. Oh, it's so unfair. Taggart glanced at Boyle and smiled. The smile was pointed. It seemed to say that something in his words was an answer to something in the words of Boyle. The liquor they serve here is swill. I suppose that's the price we have to pay for not being crowded by all kinds of rabble. I do wish they'd recognize that they're dealing with experts. Since I hold the purse strings, I expect to get my money's worth, and at my pleasure.
So, Greg, when I first read this, I think I thought the same thing that a lot of people online thought, which was, well, this is just a way of showing that Jim Taggart is some kind of hypocrite. He's, he talks about being a man of the people who's interested in promoting the public interest, but look how he treats the help, and he acts like a king.
Yeah, I hold the purse. He's imperious. Right. He's a little, and I think it is meant to show that. I definitely agree.
Going on,
but that doesn't explain why something in his words is answering something in Boyle. How is this saying something to Boyle? And I think what's going on is Boyle's hinting around that we need something done in Washington. And Jim then spreads out, this is my table, I'm in charge here. The liquor they serve here is swill. Since I hold the purse strings, I expect what I want and at my pleasure, when I want it. So then look at what happens next, right? What immediately follows? You wanted to read the next bit?
Boyle did not answer. His face had become sullen. Listen, Jim, he began heavily. Taggart smiled. What? I'm listening. Jim, you will agree, I'm sure there's nothing more destructive than a monopoly. And then they have this exchange. Jim says,
yes, but not unbridled competition, and starts hinting at what he wants. And that's where I think they're making a deal. And Boyle has to do something for Jim first before Jim will, because Jim only at that point says, there are people in Washington who will support this. No, not many, and not easy to approach. But I, holding my purse strings, can approach them. And then at that point, Boyle says, well, I'll talk to my friends at the National Alliance of Railroads about the thing you want.
Well, let me get to that.
And they'll talk about what that is.
So what is the thing that Boyle wants? What is the thing that Taggart wants? We talked about already how he's complaining about unbridled competition. He's complaining about it specifically with reference to some railroad that's in a territory that's traditionally handled by established railroads. This is code for Phoenix Durangos competing with us too much in Colorado. So what does Taggart want from Boyle?
To eliminate that competition.
He wants to do something to eliminate that competition, and given the exchange that happens then, since he has friends in the legislature and is willing to do something for Boyle about Reardon, he's expecting that Boyle is going to do something for him with regard to his friends at the National Alliance of Railroads. And we're not told what they have the power to do. We're not told how exactly this is going to happen, but there's an ominous suggestion of a threat here. And we'll just have to wait and see, I guess, until...
Friendships are the most important thing in the world.
Yes, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Let me see what's happening online before I move any further.
Friendships are more valuable than gold, he says.
So somebody asks, why... Megan online asks, hi Megan, why go to the bar in the first place? Is it Jim's loyalty to that establishment, or is it strategic? That's an interesting question. It's a question about why have a setting here. And, well, there is some imagery going on also.
Well, so there's the author's reason and the character's reason. Right. The author's reason is that she wants it to be like a dank cellar in a high place for the reason. William, is that your name? Yeah, that William suggested there's this sense of an inversion going on here. But that can't be Jim's reason within the novel. The reason he gives is that he wants someplace exclusive where he's not going to be bothered by the rabble. I also have a suspicion that Jim's maybe the kind of guy who's got this complaint about any place he goes and does business. He's not treated like little Lord Fauntleroy, so everywhere he goes he finds something to have to take issue with. So that was my impression. I got the sense whatever bar Jim goes to, he'll be peeved at this.
It's also interesting that the typical this kind of stereotype is backroom deals, but this is not a backroom deal. This is it is a little bit out in the open. Now that of course explains why they're not willing to say anything very explicitly. But Al?
Yeah, I don't recall that anything is said specifically, but one of the questions that occurred to me is why didn't they have this meeting at the nice boardroom of Taggart Transcontinental? There's something secretive.
Something furtive about it.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see what is so furtive and what's so secret, I guess. But I think now is maybe a good time to say just a little bit about two characters in the scene who are, they don't play a big role in the scene, but there's a hint that there's something furtive going on with them as well, and that's Paul Larkin and Wesley Mouch. What do we know about what they have to do with what's going on here? What kind of clues are there in the chapter that will tell us how they may be involved in this deal or this plan to target Reardon and the Phoenix Durango? And again, people who are online, I encourage you to chime in, but if you, Mohammed?
Somebody mentioned already the friendship line, and someone turns to Mr. Larkin and says, friendships are more so valuable than gold. Don't you think so, Paul? And then Larkin agrees, astonished in an astonished manner. So it's probably going to have to do something with his relationship with Reardon. Is going to somehow be relevant to whatever they're doing.
So we know that Larkin is friends with Reardon from the previous chapter, and that relationship is some kind of asset in this exchange. Do we know anything else about Larkin that would help us understand why that might be an asset? What does Larkin do, for example? What does he do for a living? What's his business? It's mentioned briefly.
Any business he can get into.
Well, but what's he in now?
Sells mining equipment.
He works in mining equipment, and that comes up because Ore and Boyle's been complaining about the state of the ore industry, and because the mines can't get any ore, the mining equipment companies can't sell anything to the mines. So there's something about this situation that Boyle's in that puts him in the same boat with Boyle. So that might have something to do with what's going to happen. But we don't really know any more than that, and we will have to wait and see. And a few people, Gene and Brian online, are noting the issues with Larkin also. What about Mouch? There's really only one thing we know about Mouch.
Reardon's Washington man.
He's Reardon's Washington man.
Well, there's two things we know.
Yes.
He does not know how to think. He just goes along with what everybody else says, but he says, I think it is true. I think it is indubitable. I think it is something.
Certainty is not part of his...
Well, it's...
Well, but he wants to pretend that he's using words like true and indubitable. He wants to pretend that he can think, but he doesn't really...
There's a kind of double talk going on.
Yeah, he doesn't really contribute any facts.
There's a third thing.
Absolute opinion, right?
What's the third?
Well, the third thing is that Jim Taggart likes the fact that he doesn't talk too much.
He doesn't.
That's at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
So could it be relevant to the deal that's going down that Mouch is not going to talk too much about something to someone?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's hinted that he's not going to let Reardon know, and he's not going to block any kind of deal with the legislators that Jim Taggart wants to make.
Okay.
The other thing that's connected here is he agrees to every anti-Taggart statement, anti-Reardon statement. So again, with this kind of whether he wants to pretend that he's thinking when he's not, or whether he just wants to hedge, or whatever it is he's doing, it seems to me indubitable that is it. I'm sure the case. It seems to me whatever he's always agreeing with every abstract statement that's made by the other people at the table, which abstract statements are all obviously pretexts for attacking Reardon's business. And yet this is precisely the kind of thing it seems like it's his job to fight. Someone on the, I forget the name of it, Ellen, was it? Someone on the list had speculated as to why he's doing this. Maybe he's trying to ingratiate himself to these people so that he could help Reardon out by tipping them off what he's onto. Or maybe he's a snake in the grass of some sort. Or maybe he's annoyed that Reardon doesn't like him because we heard in the previous chapter that Reardon thinks the people who have to do this kind of work are crooks. Incidentally, where did we hear that Reardon thinks the people you have to hire for your Washington men are a bad lot? Why did that come up in the last chapter? Does anyone remember?
Because Larkin asked
Larkin
him.
asked him. How's
Yeah.
the Washington man?
So now we have a sense as to why Larkin was there warning him. He felt an obligation to warn him against this. And I don't know, any thoughts about Larkin and Mouch? I mean, both of them seem like they're setting up to betray a relationship with Reardon. Any thoughts on similarities or differences between them? Ben or anyone?
I would say Larkin's much more toward of it because he kind of leads why he's doing it versus Mouch just doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, Larkin's looking for a rationalization, how he couldn't help it. And when Mouch piles on with the same rationalizations, Larkin's like sick about it and wants to like, I'm not like you. I think that's about all we have. I mean, Mouch doesn't seem conflicted about this. He seems like happy to do it.
Well, actually, I was surprised, but it's Larkin who, I think, brings up the term historical necessity first. He says, but I'm a student of history, said Larkin hastily. I recognize historical necessity. And I was surprised about that because, you know, you get the sense that he's being dragged into this unwillingly, and yet he has this theory behind everything that's going to drag him into it, even just as much as the people do.
He's appealing to the historical necessity factor as something that's going to exculpate him, excuse him from blame for whatever he's about to do.
It's on the right side of history.
Yeah.
I couldn't help it.
There's a lot of I couldn't help it going on in this chapter. But Mike?
William?
William.
Okay, after this discussion, I remembered an episode of Yes, Minister, which illustrates exactly what we now realize Larkin has been up to. And there, the hacker's civil service advisors suggest that he follow the Rhodesia solution in regard to warning the Prime Minister about what he's supposed to warn him about. And he asked, what's that? Well, you see, the minister told the Prime Minister. And what did the Prime Minister do, I wanted to know? Ah, said Sir Humphrey, the minister in question told the Prime Minister in such a way that the Prime Minister didn't hear him. So here, Larkin feels he has a duty, as noted in the last chapter, to warn Reardon that his Washington man is not doing what he's supposed to be doing, but he does it without actually saying anything.
So he's kind of discharged his duty formally without any actual substantive effect, and probably by design.
As Hacker does in the Whiskey Priest episode.
Yeah. Alex Online mentions that historical necessity is a bit of Marxist jargon. Some people were asking about that earlier. And I think I had said something about that too at one point.
Well, I think I want to do at least one more topic on this scene, and then we can move on to the nicer scenes in the chapter. But I think it's important to think about what is motivating these characters. And this is a possibly more complex topic than it at first seems. Why are Taggart and Boyle wanting to target Reardon and the Phoenix Durango in the way they're doing it? And one way of figuring out why people want to do something is to ask them and see how they explain their actions, and they're doing that to a certain extent. I mean, they're invoking these kind of philosophical principles about the public interest and how they see either monopoly or unbridled competition as harming the public interest, and they want to protect that. That's what they say motivates them. But as a few people in the online discussion previously pointed out, it seems like there's certain respects in which they're applying these principles selectively. So, I mean, they both say they disagree with the idea of monopoly, and yet, I mean, what? So Taggart, for example, says he doesn't agree with the idea of monopolistic control, but what can we say about Taggart?
He wants it in the Southwest.
I mean, Taggart basically wants a monopoly over the railroad system, at least in this one region. And likewise, Boyle agrees with Taggart about how we can't have unbridled competition, and yet he wants to basically create artificial competition for the ore that Reardon otherwise would have been selling. So they don't seem to be applying these principles, if that's what they are, in a completely straightforward way. Why are they doing that? Why are they being selective? What's really motivating them here? And this is a question I'm particularly interested in hearing from first-time readers about, or
so let's be looking specifically on the forum for that.
Why do you suppose that Taggart and Boyle are proposing these policies that they're proposing? Why are they making this deal?
Babbitt is saying they do it out of fear. They know they can't survive and compete in a free market. That's a possibility, I think.
Pooja says that's how they operate their business instead of working at it efficaciously. I mean, it's a description of what they're doing, sure, but why would they rather, I mean, they would say this is the efficacious way. They would say, if there's a competitor who's undermining my business in Colorado, it's efficacious to get rid of him.
And to use your friendships to do it. Friendships are the most important thing, after all.
So what else can we say about why they're doing what they're doing?
Well, they whine a number of times about unfairness. So
right.
That's
relevant. They complain about unfairness.
And that's usually when people say something's unfair, they envy that somebody else has something that they don't. And there are different ways of going about rectifying the disparity. So you mentioned the efficacious element. There are different ways of doing it, and they'd rather go through the machinations of government than just try to find some other means to do it themselves.
Sure.
Well, what about what Corey says online? They're going for the public good. I mean, that's what they say, and maybe that's right. I mean, everyone's laughing, but
what would be the alternative if they weren't?
You have to. Both extremes are bad, right? Clearly, unbridled monopoly creates all kinds of problems, and Boyle was making the case for that, and Taggart didn't agree. He didn't think monopolies are just fine. He just said, yes, but you can go to the other extreme as well and have too much competition in a way that's destroying vital industries. And Boyle says you got to snip off both extremes, right? We need, after all, what standard can you tell what's too extreme in one direction or the other than the public interest? That's Corey's view. That seems like what Boyle would agree with.
Alex says the business is not the end for them; it's the means. I think that's a interesting thought to pursue. The big question, if that's true, is going to be, well, what is the end?
Alex says power over people.
Okay. We'll have to. I mean, these are all good hypotheses to consider going forward. And I think probably don't want to say too much more about that because we're going to learn more about it going forward. But Robert?
Yeah, one thing that hasn't been mentioned, that all four of them are heavily invested in the San Sebastian mines.
Okay.
Good point.
So they have something else in common. That there's another purpose here for this meeting is to get information about that.
I'm not sure about. So they are all heavily invested in it, and that becomes relevant to what kind of people these characters are. But I'm not sure that that's another purpose of this meeting, because notice that as soon as the deal between Boyle and Taggart gets made, everyone relaxes. Like it says something like what was to be understood here was understood, and then they don't have anything to say for a while, and then Boyle brings up the San Sebastian mine, and then they get all anxious about how is it, or is the investment okay? But yeah, so I don't think they were there to talk about it, but it is something that also binds them, and that's going to be relevant as we learn more about that project. I think, should we move on now, though?
Yeah, with the one observation that I think will maybe transition you, which is that we also talked a little bit in the online group about what kind of business philosophy Taggart is using here, and that's part of his motivation. We mentioned already that friendships are more valuable than gold, and we've talked about how that plays a role in this deal. I think it's worth mentioning that you get another element of his business philosophy at the very end of the section, the last line of the section, and it's worth thinking about why it's the last line of the section. He says, it all depends on knowing the people who make it possible. That's what has to be known, who makes it possible. And I just want to suggest, as we go forward through the rest of the chapter, what does that mean?
Yeah, two ways to think of it. I mean, what does Jim mean by it? And I think concretely in the moment, he means he knows these people in Washington, and Boyle knows these other people. Boyle said, we've got a lot of work to do, and the work is, calling up the people and exercising whatever kind of pressure or friendship they have on them. But does anything about the structure of the chapter imply that there might be a second answer to this question? Any thoughts?
Anybody have thoughts online as to what
Taggart might? Go ahead.
Ellen, they start with he's president at the time, I guess, and then next becomes Dagny, who's not allowed even to have the proper title of operating vice president, whatever, and she's the one who's really running things. Am I allowed to say that?
Well, I think we've seen that she really runs a lot of it, and but does anything about the way the chapter is written tip us off to that we're meant to think of Dagny in this connection?
There was one person in the online group earlier who noticed this. I don't know if...
who else? Do you remember?
I don't know if Pooja's watching, but Pooja, I think you're the one who noticed this.
Yeah, so if you just read this bit of the novel, right, and you just look at, what's the next sentence after who makes it possible?
9 years old.
So read it again because they didn't have your mic on yet.
Dagny Taggart was 9 years old. So who makes it possible? Star. Dagny Taggart
was 9 years old when she decided she was going to run the
both
railroad.
Maria and Jesse online just wanted to notice this as well. So it's William.
Yeah, so something about the structure of the chapter, and I think we see this a lot, where a statement is made by a character that has one surface meaning, but something about where it's said or what it cuts to suggests that there's another level of meaning in that statement, that somehow Dagny Taggart is who makes it possible. So let's talk about Dagny. And we learn a lot about her in this chapter, more than we knew before, and there are a couple of lenses through which we could look at this. But let's look at it in particular through the lens of a question we had about her earlier. So recall in chapter 1, which is the last time we met her, there was this issue of Jim saying she never had any feelings at all, and she was lucky about never having had any feelings. And she had a weird reaction to that. She was astonished, and then she had a look of kind of weariness after a while. And then she said, no, Jim, I never had. And we thought this was strange because we'd seen earlier in the chapter her have some pretty profound feelings. So we could see why maybe her response to him was bitter or sarcastic, or I don't have feelings the way you think of feelings, I think Gloria said in Ben's group in New Orleans. And that seems right, but there's an added element of why astonishment and then weariness. That suggested that there's something new that surprised her, and yet she then connected it to some issue she's been grappling with for a very long time and is sort of tired of. So what do we get about in chapter 3 now about Dagny's feelings across her life and her perspective on how her feelings relate to other people? Any thoughts, Mohammed?
There's an interesting paragraph, I think it's the third one, from the beginning of the new section. It says, she felt a bored indifference toward the immediate world around her, toward other children and adults alike. She took it as a regrettable accident to be born patiently for a while. Then they say she had caught a glimpse of another world and she knew that existed somewhere. The world created trains, bridges, telegraph wires, so it seemed that early on, with the things that were closest to her, she felt that, this is boring. She doesn't feel anything towards them. She was indifferent. Mm-hmm. But there are things that she does feel great admiration and joy for. One of the things also mentioned was She studied mathematics and she felt joy of admiration and of one's own abilities because how wonderful that I'm so good at it.
Good. So a few points here. One is she's bored by the people around her. She doesn't feel much about them other than this boredom. But there are other things she feels very strongly positively towards, especially mathematics and the railroad. I think that's another really interesting point, and it's a little bit earlier than where you were, about how she thinks about the railroad. So she decided when she was 9 that she was going to run the railroad someday. And then what does it say about it? I think it's right in that paragraph.
Oath to herself. She doesn't say it out loud.
Okay, good. She doesn't say it out loud. Why doesn't she say it out loud?
She doesn't need to.
She doesn't need to? That's part of it.
There's
I
nobody
think
listening.
there's another factor, though. She says she never tried to explain how she felt about the railroad or her love of the railroad. She knew, I'm quoting from memory now, so I might be getting it not exactly right, but if anyone has it, tell me. Ben's got it right here. Where is it? She never tried to explain why she liked the railroad. Whatever it was that others felt, she knew this was one emotion for which they had no equivalent and no response. So that's interesting. We're getting sort of her childhood thoughts narrated here, right? So whatever it was that others felt, that suggests that even from her time as a kid, she has the sense that something weird about other people's feelings. They're different from mine. I don't get it. Whatever it is that they feel, some weird thing. This, what I feel for the railroad and for math, other people don't feel, and they have no response to it. That is, they have no response to this kind of feeling either. So if I tell them the railroad is one of the things I feel like this about, they're not going to have anything to say. And that's something she's been dealing with since she was 9, which makes a lot of sense of why when Jim says you've never felt anything, she would be weary about it. Like, oh, this again. Now, there are some other issues to why she was astonished, but this has been an issue for her since she was 9. Now, what does she feel about the railroad? Well, she feels this tremendous excitement. It represents some other type of world that she wants to get to, right? And she feels it also in math. Mohammed, you said, what is it that she feels about math that you focused on?
Quote, how great, oh no, wait, yeah, 2 things. How great that men have done this, and how wonderful that I'm so good at it.
Good. So she also describes math as like an adversary, and an adversary that she's pleased to match. So we see in a lot of her motivations she's a challenge and an excitement to face the challenge, and a pleasure in her ability to face it well. And we see that also in her attitude towards the railroad. There's a humility as she stands around the railroad because she's learning about all these great things that have been achieved with it, but there's a hint of future pride because she'll be able to do it better someday. Where else do we see this combination of a great challenge and, someone saying something online?
Well, finish your sentence.
A great challenge and a pleasure at their ability to meet it, or excitement to meet it. Ben, was there something online you
I
wanted?
thought you were going to say something else.
Okay. Karen?
Oh, well, actually was going to make another point, but I thought that the parallel you might likely be looking for is when Reardon, after 10 years of struggle, creates successfully Reardon Metal. So we saw that pleasure he allows himself to feel at having finally succeeded with that. He actually feels some happiness. So there's a parallel there about that challenge and meeting it.
Good. That isn't in particular what I was thinking about, but I think it is definitely a parallel.
Something I was going to say a bit was, if I can comment, unless you wanted to pursue that question further.
Yeah, actually, let me just pursue this one.
Okay.
We are a little later than we're in time. Does anyone have any thoughts on where else we've seen this that connect to Dagny even?
For Dagny specifically, 2 spots. One is when she's by the Nat Taggart statue, and the other is back in chapter 1 when she's listening to the music. There's the Symphony of Triumph, and then there's Nat Taggart, her one goal in life, I assume other than running the railroad, but her was to be able to hold her head like that.
Yeah.
What she really wanted out of life. All that Dagny wanted out of life was contained in the desire to hold her head as he did.
And how does he hold his head?
Yeah, and how does he hold his
Well,
head?
facing a challenge, found joy in the capacity to meet it.
Yeah, and I think the music is another great example. It's a music that's progressing towards something. She also is described in that same scene a little later as feeling the cold, hard, exhilarating pleasure of action. So we see a lot about this in her character.
There's
What are we getting online?
A couple of interesting things online. So one person pointed out that Jay says, with reference to her view of her work, but as embodied in walking through the terminal and looking at the statue, that for her it's kind of a personal, sacred feeling, and we've seen some kind of quasi-religious imagery used in a similar connection, not with her, but with somebody else. Anybody remember who? In the first chapter, as it turns out.
Are you thinking?
In his mouth?
It wasn't Reardon.
Well, I mean, there is also with Reardon, he's like a crusader returning when he gives her the thing. But if the first chapter, are you thinking of Eddie's attitude towards sacrifice?
Yeah.
The slogan "From ocean to ocean forever" is so much more gleaming than any commandment of the Bible. And
Yes. So I think that's what Jay was commenting on, and a few people also point out that for Dagny there's loneliness and happiness, just like with Reardon, and I think that's apt.
yeah, I think that becomes a really big issue in chapter 4. So we'll look forward to talking about that. One other thing, though, that I think is connected to that loneliness issue here in chapter 3 that it's worth bringing out is we're getting in chapter 4 the progression of her career, right? And so as a child, she's bored by the people around her, but she sees it as a temporary accident that she's around people that just aren't that interesting and that don't have any equivalent for her feeling of the railroad. But she's seen this other world, the world that created rails and blinking lights, and she just has to be patient. Someday she's going to grow up into it. And at 16, she starts working for the railroad, and she thinks she's in that world now, but not for long. It's a disappointment, right? And what happens is there's nobody on the railroad that lives up to her standards. There's no other people. Everybody else is not making decisions, and she's advancing, but it's as though she's advancing through empty rooms. She's not competing with people to do the job better, and then she gets a promotion. It's no one's doing it, and she's taking over things because everybody's apathetic or slothful. Her whole career seems to be like that first scene we saw with her, where the 2 people don't know what to do with running the train, or the 3 people. He says, well, why don't you do this? And then now she has the authority to tell them, but throughout her whole career, she keeps making decisions that other people don't know what to do or are afraid to make. And she advances. And Reardon also, we see this about him, as in how he advanced from minor to magnate. It sounds like a self-help book or something, or novel. Al?
Yeah, since you mentioned Dagny's loneliness, I'd like to backtrack a little bit, since loneliness often means the absence of good friends. The references to friendship in that cellar in the sky, they don't mean by friendship what Dagny would mean or what I think anyone else would mean here.
Good.
Shared values, it's not benevolence. Those people don't even like each other.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So they're talking about friendship in the first in the barroom scene. It's disingenuous. Jim's crowding out the people around the table, and there's some kind of pressure politics that's going on that they call friendship. And we haven't really, have we seen any positive examples of friendship yet? Maybe one, maybe Dagny and Eddie.
Yeah.
And, it's an interesting thing I noticed this time through about Dagny and Eddie, because I've been wondering about this childhood conversation they have, where, from Eddie's perspective, she tells him what they're going to do. And it's interesting when you see their childhood narrated from Eddie's perspective. It's a lot more Dagny's in charge, and she tells Eddie what to do. When you see it from Dagny's perspective narrated, it's not that way. So when it's narrated from her perspective, it's she and Eddie Willers from their early childhood devoted. It's like me and my friend Eddie, and yet Eddie doesn't seem to be at least a large dose of her world yet. So she does tell Eddie that she's going to run the railroad, right? She doesn't tell no one. She tells Eddie, and I don't know if she thinks he understands it or not. But it seems like she doesn't get everything she needs from a friend from Eddie. But he is at least the best. Seems like the most genuine example of a friendship we have. Although also Eddie's got a friendship with this worker at the end, so maybe 2 examples. But Ben, let's go on to. Oh, there was one other thing. Dagny's metaphor for this fact that there's something that is holding her back. It's not sort of super easy to advance in her career, and yet it's not skilled people that she's competing with, is that there's a gray spread of cotton that's blocking her path. And it's not like an adversary that's worth fighting. It's just some gross, lame thing that somehow slows her down. And she wonders what makes it possible. And I think that what makes it possible question is interesting. I don't think we know enough to say much about it now, but just we should register it as a question. And we're getting a lot of these who makes it possible, what makes it possible questions.
It's worth reading the actual text.
Yeah, read it, please.
She stood disarmed before the riddle of what made this possible. She could find no answer. That's on page 52 of the standard.
And the this, again, is this gray spread of cotton. But let's move on to the other stuff about Taggart Transcontinental and the board, which we were talking about.
Do you still want me to do this?
I don't think so. We didn't get enough traction on the. Let's take it up on the board afterwards.
So we talked at the beginning about the decisions of the little click at the top of the skyscraper. It's worth talking also now about the decisions that are made by the board of Taggart Transcontinental. It gives us both a window into the kind of the history and the context of the job that Dagny's doing, but there's questions that she has about their decisions that I think give us some insight into her and the way she's approaching the situation. So we know that both she and her brother start working from the company when they're relatively young. She starts working as the night operator at Rockdale Station, and he works in PR. 13 years later, their father dies, and James inherits the stock. Her father had said to Dagny, "There will always be a Taggart to run the railroad." He looks at her knowingly, but with a hint of sadness. And what we find then are, because James inherits the stock, he's the one who's in the position to become, who's in the best position at least to be nominated as president of the board of directors. And we asked a question online: what decisions does the board make? And there are three big ones, and people got this pretty quickly. But so the first decision is to hire James as president. The second is what? Just to build the San Sebastian line. And the third is what? Hiring Dagny as VP. Now those are pretty easy to find if you go through the text. What I think is more interesting to discuss about this is why they do what they do in making these decisions, and especially why is Dagny confused about why they do what they do? Because for each of them, it is explicitly mentioned she is confused. And I think for some of them it's less confusing than for others, but there's a degree of confusion for each of them for her. So let's talk about the first one first. So the first one is hiring Jim. So start off with this. Why would this not be a surprise at all that they hire Jim? Why do they say they're hiring?
And she isn't surprised, right? She expects them to do it.
Surprised.
What she's surprised by is what?
How eagerly.
Right, how eagerly they do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So why? First of all, why would it make sense for Jim to be hired? Yes.
Traditionally, I mean, he's the eldest son. That's who traditionally ends up inheriting.
That's one of the two big factors. That it seems.
He has controlling interest in the stock, and then he's got Washington skills. He's risen on those.
And he's got Washington ability, and he's started out in working for PR. So those are their stated reasons, pretty much, and on some level they make sense. But why would Dagny be confused about this? Why would it be odd that they should do it so eagerly?
Notice what Sandy's saying in the chat. They elected James in the same manner as they refused to walk under a ladder. That's from the book. So in what manner do people refuse to walk under a ladder? Superstition, fear, yeah.
An automatic decision without thinking through what's important. Just, oh, there it is, grab it and go with it.
Yeah.
We've always done it that way.
Yeah. So we've always done it that way, maybe out of some superstitious fear or something. And you're saying, and that saves them they don't have to do any thinking because of that?
But I mean, Dagny has had a kind of negative opinion about the way things are run by the board and the way that Jim does things for a while now. So it shouldn't be such a surprise that they are trapped in this kind of traditionalist mindset. why does she regard it as superstitious, though? Why doesn't she understand why people make decisions like this? Why is this confusing to her? Why they should be superstitious in this way? There are some hints. And it has something to do with the very reasons that they give for doing it. We know her reasons are, their reasons are tradition and Washington ability. What is it about those reasons that she doesn't understand?
She doesn't think those are the things that would make a railroad good.
Yeah. She doesn't think these would make a railroad good. And Judy online says kind of the same point. She knows what James doesn't know. She knows that at one point she even says, well, he was not smart enough to harm the railroad too much. So
I think for
She doesn't even know what Washington ability is.
and that's the other one that she knows that this is their reason, but what is Washington ability and why should it matter to running a railroad? And she knows that they say this, and so she knows that that's the official explanation, but she doesn't really understand why that would serve as an adequate justification.
I think before we can get too far in coming up with the explanation of both why they're doing it and why she doesn't understand it, we might want to add the other case and see, because we've got a few factors now that are present in this case. Good. And see if any of those factors are common denominators among the three cases.
And I think that the confusion mounts for each of the other two decisions. So how about the San Sebastian mines? Now, what's the most obvious reason why it would seem like there's nothing to be confused about here in their decision to do this? What's the big factor that they cite? The board.
For the source of good, the Mexican people?
That's part of the reason, sure.
This is the
The public interest.
long-range profit from.
Why would they
running
expect
track
long-range profit from a decision?
Francisco d'Ancona.
Because the guy who's building the mines, who bought the property, is Francisco, and everything that he touches is supposed to turn to gold, and he's never lost money on a deal, or copper, right? And he's never lost money on a deal. So they've got a case, but why is Dagny confused about this?
What's missing from the case?
What is missing?
Evidence, the facts.
Mineralogical facts in particular, like historical facts about Francisco's net worth are maybe in evidence, but yeah, mineralogical facts are missing.
And what's it coming at the cost of, this decision? The Rio Norte line, which is the Colorado line, and it's happening right when Wyatt and his oil fields are coming online, and there's customers who need trains and who are willing to pay for it, but for some reason instead the need of the Mexican people is coming first.
And notice in connection with this line, Jim Taggart was saying in the first chapter, who could have predicted that this Ellis Wyatt would have come up in Colorado? Nobody was expecting that. Just like now at the beginning of Chapter 3, they're saying, well, totally unavoidable. Who could have known there was going to be a ore shortage? And it's a natural thing. But it turns out that Dagny and some of the other people at Taggart Transcontinental did know. And it seems like maybe Dan Conway running the Phoenix Durango knew. So there are indications that this was knowable.
And so then last decision.
Oh, Ben, look at what Judy's saying here. This might be, you can see it on this screen.
Washington?
She's pointing out that Reardon has the same issue of he recognizes you need to have a man in Washington, but he doesn't quite understand why or how to pick one.
To hire to do it.
So it's similar to Dagny's attitude towards, well, we need a Washington guy, Jim wants to do it.
So, yeah.
You were looking for the common denominator between the first and the second decision? Or do you want to go straight on to the
We've got a third, but...
Well, yeah, if you've got one, go ahead.
I do. Should I say it?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so again, it's automatic. They don't have to think because Francisco does all the thinking for them. I mean, he's succeeded before, so they don't want to take the time to decide whether, well, they may not even care whether it succeeds or not. They can hide behind his decision, and they can follow it if it succeeds.
In my view, that's the essence of the board in these scenes, that the board avoids sticking its neck out, avoids thinking, is looking for some answer in the back of the book that they can follow. And I think they do it in these two cases. But we should see if there's something deeper we learn behind that, or if that's as far as it goes down. We should look at this third case,
and
too.
how does that come up in the third case? I mean, maybe having stated that, it's particularly clear. The third case is the decision to hire Dagny after she threatens to quit. Why is she threatening to quit, by the way?
not getting the title or the pay that she deserved after 3 years of doing the work.
Is it that she's not getting the title and payment she
A
deserves?
little more. What's that?
Well, Jim's friend as operating vice president.
Jim's friend, who's operating vice president, is getting in the way of everything.
Yes.
He won't make any decisions and does his best to stop her from making decisions.
And notice the progression here. So the previous operating vice president, who was presumably the one in the time of their father, had opposed this deal. He stepped down when they decided to build the San Sebastian mine, as did a few other board members. Jim puts one of his people in charge, like the guy he put in charge of the Ohio division we saw in the first thing, who never got anything done. Dagny now, it's not that she resents not being in charge exactly, or she wants the title. It's that she can't get any work done because any decision the guy makes is her decision, but he only makes it after spending a lot of time trying to make it as hard as her for possible, which sounds like who? That's exactly how Jim operates, right? So she says, I can't do it, and she's willing to quit. Note she had been willing to quit before, or she thought about quitting before, but wasn't willing to do it. Now and then when she gives them that ultimatum, they make her operating vice president, and she's surprised, really surprised, right?
I mean, why would she be confused about the fact that somebody wants to slough off responsibility like this and not make any decisions and just want to count on either Francisco or her to make them? Okay.
Decision maker.
So she doesn't empathize with that attitude, for one thing. It's not her characteristic way of doing things. I think there's probably a lot that's packed into that issue right there, and we're going to find out more about it, perhaps, going forward. I think that's all I had on that question. But I mean, Dagny's not just confused about the decisions of the board. There's a lot of characters in this novel she's confused about, and you know, she when she's doing her job, when she's in her own realm, she's completely competent and confident in what she's doing. But there's interpersonal issues that cause her a lot of angst and uncertainty, and it's important to the story here, and it's worth paying attention to this and other psychological dimensions of her character moving through the rest of the reading.
So we had one or two more things on our agenda. One of them was talking a bit about Francisco d'Anconia, but we're going to hear so much more about him in the next two chapters. I think it's okay to postpone discussion of him. We have a few miscellaneous issues we might take up, but let's also see what you guys, both you guys here in New York and you guys all across the world, issues that you guys would like to discuss or talk about, and we'll see how they fit in with the ones we have, and we'll pick whichever ones there seem to be the most interest in. So is there any topics that are really weighing on people here? Robert?
Well, the whole section on Nat Taggart, the hero worship that she has, the fact that he's family, she's a little resentful of that because she admires him so much that she doesn't want it to be an unchosen, some kind of...
So there are a couple of issues with Nat Taggart. People online, if you have any Nat Taggart issues, now's the time for them. So a big one is she admires him, and yet she, what's the word for it? She regrets that he's a family member, and yet she would have chose him as a family member. What do you want to? Does anybody, either Robert or anyone else, want to share any perspective on that?
In where I'm from, generally people always talk about their ancestors, and they assume because they have their ancestors were great, therefore they're great. She actually looks up to him for his greatness, and she wants to be like him, but it's not because she shares his blood per se. It's because she takes those actions.
Yeah, she doesn't want it to be ancestor worship in the. As she said, she's incapable of loving anything that isn't of her own choice.
And it's worth thinking about that in connection with, I think now that it occurs to me, stuff that's happening at the beginning of the chapter, where the the people who are party to this pact, they want very much to absolve themselves of responsibility and absolve themselves from blame by saying it was something out of our control. You get the sense they'd be very happy to be able to take credit for things that weren't in their control.
And likewise the board, as Anna was talking about, who are trying to avoid responsibility.
Whereas for Dagny, accidents of birth and circumstance are not the foundational thing. What matters is the choices that you make, apparently. And you see, it's interesting to compare Dagny with James, because, if ever there were a case to say, somebody lucked out in life and was just the fortune of their birth that gave them the advantages that they have, well, how about if you take two heirs to a fortune? And aren't they just lucky? And in some sense they certainly are, but you see that James and Dagny, even though they're born to the same family and given the same advantages at birth, they do very different things with them, and they make very different choices about them.
Judy says something interesting about Nat. She says that Dagny looks up to his results, but not necessarily to his means of that accomplishment. I don't know, Judy, is there something in particular in mind that's making you say that? I can
segue to the other issue.
I can suggest one thing. We're told a number of things about Nat Taggart that might strike one as unseemly, that a lot of people object to, and that particularly if you look at critical authors who dislike Rand writing about her. There have been a number of, what I learned from reading Atlas Shrugged, that are a little bit snarky articles that are out there. And there's this guy who I cited his blog once before, Daylight Atheist, who blogged his way through the whole novel, making very critical comments, a lot of them, on each chapter. And they're interesting to look at what someone who's very much not in sympathy with the ideas of the novel finds of interest in each chapter. I don't recommend everyone out there reading him, because occasionally his blog comments on a chapter contain spoilers for the next chapter, but if you've read it before, it's interesting. Anyway, it's pointed out that he does some troubling things, right? He throws a guy down 3 flights of stairs for offering to give him a government loan. So you might think he's opposed to government loans. He could have said no. What's the 3 flights? And then to get the money that he needed this loan for, he engages in a kind of weird bet where he's betting his wife or giving her as collateral for the loan, and she's okay with it, which is good. But it still seems, a peculiar business practice he might not think well of. And then he might murder a state senator who might have murdered a state senator who, in the Wild West somewhere, was engaged in some kind of scheme to short sell his railroad, or was somehow trying to use his position as a senator to extort money or hurt his business, and it's not proven, but he may have killed him. So a lot of people think this makes Nat Taggart a bad guy, Dagny bad for admiring him. What do we make of this? Somebody online, I forget who, Marianne, I think, said maybe these are just meant to be jokes or exaggerations, that anybody would think this about somebody. And it is true that Rand says that how he built this railroad is kind of devolved into legend. And so we can't be sure of how much, and he's an infamous character. He's like a figure about whom there are all these tall tales. And the tall tales have in common that he was dedicated and ruthless about pursuing his railroad, that he didn't want to be involved with the government, and that maybe he took some kind of extreme measures of these sorts. What are we to make of that? Does Dagny, maybe that's what Judy is, yes, it says that she is responding to when she says Dagny admires his results, not necessarily his means. So she says the story of killing someone as an example. Do we get any indication that Dagny's bothered by that? Does it say Dagny, wanted to hold his head like he did, but and thought he couldn't have killed anyone? Or does Dagny's admiration of him seems unqualified, as far as I can tell.
James says Dagny respects his ability to overcome the gray. I assume he's talking about Cotton.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, his ability to overcome the gray. Carrie Ann?
Well, the bad things attributed to him about the means he used to get this are many stories were whispered. It was said. It turned into legend. Why did it turn into legend? It says because people preferred not to understand it or believe how it was possible for him to rise as a self-made man on his own effort. What we do see is him engaging in good means, not some hearsay about bad means. He goes door to door, making contracts, persuading people with his word, not taking government handouts or subsidies or using the force of law to make people deal with him. He honors contracts. So the means that is established in the narrative that he did are all through consent and persuasion, and the bad things are hearsay stories, and people want to believe the hearsay stories and not what he did.
So you might be thinking he didn't do these things. Anyone who did the kinds of things that he really did do would acquire this kind of reputation from people like Jim and Orrin Boyle. This is the kind of thing they'd whisper, and he'd get a reputation for doing this even if he didn't, and so we're meant to assume he didn't. That's possible.
And you get that he's famous, and the story of his life is repeated not in homage but in resentful curiosity, and if anyone admired him, it was only as one admires a successful bandit. So the things that he's admired for are these rumors.
Yeah.
Almost.
Now, I don't think it's true that Dagny doesn't. We don't get in Dagny's description that she's concerned like he might have done these things. We also don't get that she's confident he didn't. But I think it's because she doesn't admire him for killing someone, if he did, in particular. That's not what she focused on. She's focused on that he built this thing, his determination, that he did it on his own, that he overcame tremendous obstacles. But she's also not too concerned about whether these rumors are true, I think. And it's not, I think Judy's point is right if what we're saying is she's not focused on maybe he killed somebody when she admires him, but she's also not she's not concerned to defend him that he didn't, or concerned to say I admire him unless he killed someone or something.
True, but she's somebody we see wants to go by evidence, and the fallacy from ignorance is to say, well, there's no evidence he didn't do it. You have to set that aside. There's no evidence that he did any of those bad things, so why would she take seriously hearsay stories when there's no evidence? She's not going to place any weight on it.
An interesting thought experiment would be, would her attitude about him change if she found evidence that he really did these things?
No, I think the two stories, the one about him throwing the guy down the stairs and the one about him killing the state senator, are a little bit different, because the throwing the guy down the stairs, it sounds like he had an emotional outburst against somebody who offered him something he didn't want. It seems like it would be an exaggerated story of someone. In the state senator case, he actually was on trial for it, but it wasn't proved. And what's being said is that the guy is in effect trying to extort him. So you might think he's justified in killing the state senator. You might think he's not justified in killing a state senator because that would be taking the law into his own hands in a way that's wrong. But nonetheless, it's an understandable sort of thing to do if you're out in the Wild West where there isn't really much law, and you might think it's a moral gray area. I don't think we're told enough to tell. I don't think, though, and this I'm relying on something later in the novel for, but I don't think it's true that Dagny dismisses that story as false. I don't think it's a spoiler. At one point later, she references it to something that she doesn't know whether it's true, but we'll talk about that. Anna, yeah.
Oh, okay. So whether she thinks there might be any evidence or not. I mean, I'm leaning more towards what Carrie-Anne said because of all of those comments, but I think that she views him more as just an historical hero. I mean, that's enough, all right. But beyond that, I think she sees him as an ally from the past whose spirit is helping her through the difficult times. And the reason why I think that is because the very last paragraph where they talk about the statue. Tonight she looked at the statue when she walked across the concourse. It was a moment's rest. It was as if a burden she could not name were lightened, and as if a faint current of air were touching her forehead. Now, we know that's not a ghost, but the faint current of air is touching her forehead, meaning her mind, I assume. And spiritually, we already know that she's very moved by him from the previous paragraph. The moment's rest is because she's the one carrying the burden of making all the responsible decisions. And he's the only one that she knows of at this point that where she has a physical, artistic manifestation of him being in front of her, where he can look at the statue and recall what it took to get here. And he's there alive in her mind. Because everybody else, and it's stated in the book that everybody else forgot about him. But when she first comes into the concourse, it also says, the vaulting held a solemn piece of the cathedral spread in protection high above the rushing activity of men. So there's a way in which he's a guardian of that concourse, and she's grateful that he's there.
And she has this kind of religious attitude towards it. Like, he's her conception of the exalted. He represents everything she wants out of life. He's a figure who has this great spiritual meaning to her. And I think this great spiritual meaning comes from him having built the railroad, him being somebody who accomplished something great despite tremendous obstacles, and not from any of these particular anecdotes. I think he's presented, as Dagny is, as an admirable character, right? I think he's presented for the audience to have a positive view of. That doesn't necessarily mean that Dagny admires every single thing she's heard about him, or thinks it's true, and it doesn't mean that we necessarily should. It might be that Dagny admires some things, but we're meant to think that Dagny's not totally right. I think we have to, or that she is, but some of these stories are, or maybe it's okay to kill senators in certain situations. I think we have to go forward in the novel to figure out both what Dagny thinks and what the author thinks about this. And we might end up agreeing or disagreeing with both or either of them. But Ayn Rand could have written this to make it sort of totally obvious that there was nothing bad about Nat Taggart and that every charge against him was unjust, right? She wrote it in such a way that it wouldn't be self-evident that there's no problems with this guy and he's an unalloyed hero. I think that's significant in the same way as it's significant that she wrote the sequence with Reardon's family, such that it's not obvious that in every respect Reardon is totally in the right and they're totally in the wrong, although Reardon is still written as a sympathetic character. We'll have to go
one
forward.
person
Go ahead.
wanted to talk about the cigarette topic. Actually, James.
Okay.
We have some other.
Close one thought on that?
All right, Robert. Yeah.
Historically, this is very much Cornelius Vanderbilt. If you know Vanderbilt's history, which I know very well, there are a lot of similarities. And what Ben said earlier about the bandit is the robber baron that's attributed. The statue of Cornelius Vanderbilt right outside Grand Central, and looking over what's happening inside there as well.
I think that's right. He's a kind of Nat Taggart is a kind of epitome of a robber baron figure. And there's a question raised as to why do the robber barons have this reputation? Is it just? What's true about it? And I think we are meant to think that they're in some ways people like Dagny, and that Dagny's the opinions people have of her. Anna, you mentioned that the only thing that Dagny gets kind of relief from in her present, or a feeling of what she wants out of life in her present, is the Nat Taggart statue. I think that's almost true. There's one exception, though.
Of life was contained in the desire.
Yeah, but
that's just what it says.
Also, is there any other scene though but also she gets this kind of relief, or this sense of a burden lifted when she gets to the statue. Just one quick, did anyone notice if there's any other place in this chapter where she experiences that? There is one other place. Kelly's music is later, and earlier. What?
The cigarette man?
There's something she likes about the cigarette man, but it's not, and that's the next thing we're going to move on to. If you want.
This one goes by fast.
It goes by fast, but it is significant, I think. So she's in her office when Jim comes storming in all puffed up from his meeting where he's the big dog, right? And he's going to yell at her for what she's done with the traffic on the San Sebastian line. And when he finds her, we've now got narrator past, and she's looking over her books, and she's trying to figure out what lines could save the system and in how long. And she's happy that the Rio Norte line could do it. And then what does it say, Carrie? And you're smiling like you just noticed it.
She's on the phone with Hank Reardon.
Well, she's remembering being on the phone. And
Yeah.
what happens?
Page 56.
The thought I'm sorry, page 60 of the mass market edition. So she's recalling the phone call where he says one word, sure. The thought was a point of support. And she was suddenly able to find it easier to concentrate on her work. There was one thing at least that could be counted upon not to crumble when needed, and it's Hank Rearden.
Yeah. So we've got some reason to think that Dagny and Hank are going to be important to each other, not just as business allies, but Dagny's really something she's looking for out of like people who aren't like Cotton, people who are like Nat Taggart, people who are worthy allies or adversaries, and she gets that from Hank.
Not to crumble.
Campton.
A lot like not Cotton.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So the cigarette vendor. What do people want to talk about?
Well, somebody just said, let's talk about the cigarette vendor. And I heard a couple people say that here, too.
So somebody, what do you want to talk about the cigarette vendor?
Well, the question was, what's the significance of it? What's the significance of it? That's one of those really general open questions that people don't like online. But is it just everybody should smoke because it's a...
There's a point of fire alive in you when you think.
I'll say this. I do think it's interesting that the opening scene is mostly alcohol. The closing scene involves cigarettes. I don't know that there's any significance.
But it's not. We've had this. So it's not literally the closing scene. The scene with Eddie Willers is after it. And alcohol and cigarettes are such ubiquitous features of life at this time, I don't think.
It would be hard to find a metaphor like fire held in a man's hand for alcohol.
Fire in a man's belly?
We're all going to go out for drinks after this.
So I'm not convinced. I mean, I think it's a pretty metaphor involving smoking if we're talking about what the cigarette vendor says. That feels a bit dated now that we mostly associate smoking with the health risks from it.
But there are some things you learn about the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think what's more significant is what you learn about the world.
So
Go
what
ahead.
do we learn about the world through the eyes of the cigarette vendor?
Decline over the past 20 years, how people walk fast.
Yeah, so two things about the decline, right? One is there are fewer and fewer people manufacturing cigarettes, and it doesn't seem to be because people have, cottoned to the health risks and they're now all using e-cigarettes or something, or nicotine gum. It's that, in general, it's another example of things not being produced.
I think
but
what
also,
was just talking about was what's on the bottom of page 61. They used to rush through here, and it was wonderful to watch. It was the hurry of men who knew they were going and were eager to get there. Now they're hurrying because they're afraid. It's not a purpose that drives them, it's fear.
Inez
they're not going anywhere, they're escaping.
Inez, I think that's how you pronounce that, says, he means how people are changing their view of life as they are becoming more anxious.
Yeah. And one of the things we've been talking about tonight is what are motivating these characters? What's motivating the members of the pact at the beginning? What's motivating the members of the board? And now we've just talked about what's motivating Dagny and Rearden.
And Nat, yeah.
And well, there's two different kinds of motivation that the cigarette vendor is observing here. And how do these two types parse out in terms of the characters that we've been talking about tonight?
Robin, did you
just to go back to the contrast between cigarettes and alcohol? I think there is a point there because alcohol is classified as a depressant, and nicotine, the active ingredient in cigarettes, is a stimulant. So I think there's something to that.
So you could think it maybe has something to do with these two types of motivation, that people who favor stimulants are wanting to act and go towards things, whereas people favoring depressants are trying to escape?
There was
Possibly.
Worth pointing out that Rand describes the bartender as being servant to men's relaxation and pleasure, but his manner was that of an embittered quack ministering to some guilty disease. So I take it the implication is that it doesn't have to be
I think there's no contrast intended between alcohol and cigarettes at all. I think there's a contrast intended between different people's attitudes toward things that are meant to be sources of relaxation and pleasure. But we'll see about that. I could be wrong, but we'll look for more evidence in how each of these are used as metaphors going forward. But let's go back to the point that Inez was making and that you were making and that Robert was making about people becoming more anxious, being more motivated by fear rather than by anticipation or eagerness for something. You're suggesting that the people at the top in the cellar at the top of the skyscraper are more fearful. This is going to be a major topic in Chapter 4. This issue of different characters' motivations contrasted. So keep an eye out for that.
And maybe the point about the people at the top of the skyscraper being more fearful is a good segue to talking about the
top and the bottom.
Top and the bottom.
Yeah. So Al raised this earlier, that the title is the top and the bottom. You're the one who raised it earlier, aren't you? That the people at the it was William who raised it earlier. Sorry, William, for confusing you and Al, or Al. I'm not sure who to apologize to. Anyway, sorry to both of you guys for confusing you. But William, do you want to say more about your thoughts on the significance of the title?
What I said was, it seems like the top and the bottom have been exchanged somehow.
Yeah, so we talked about the top side of that the people on the top they're in a room that looks like it's on the bottom. They're
seems like a cellar.
Seems like a cellar. They're doing things furtive. They're not talking in the kinds of voices that are suitable for the open air and so forth. Low ceiling. What about the bottom? What's at the bottom in this world?
Just in terms of the description of the actual scene.
Yeah, the last scene is at the bottom.
Cafeteria.
How is it described?
Well, there are men. They're speaking. There's Eddie Willers with the worker. It seems to be kind of like a joyous atmosphere. I don't say joyous, but
it's sparkling clean.
Yeah.
The high ceilings. There's lots of light. It's
She
sensitive.
refers to light and space
underground.
in both the beginning and the end. Light and space are both adjectives.
It's literally underground at the bottom of a skyscraper, right? Because the Taggart building is a skyscraper.
Also, the concourse sometimes
it's
is on a lower level, though, too. So the description of the concourse I took to be at the bottom, too. Sometimes it's
Yes.
ground level, sometimes it's lower level.
So the concourse also with Nat Target's statue is at the bottom. And with Dagny in it. And we're told that, right? She doesn't go out to the lobby. She goes down to the concourse to go out.
Okay.
Right? So, again, the statue of Nat Taggart is at the bottom.
So why to the people there that when Eddie Willis sees the worker, he waves, it's friendly, that they want to be around each other to talk about what they're going to talk about versus the people at the top, where it's kind of the dirty business that they're doing.
And they're talking really directly at the bottom. So Eddie's talking to this worker, and he's not kind of hinting vaguely at some problems Taggart Transcontinental may be having or on what they're relying on in some vague kind of innuendo. He says to this worker directly straight out, this is the situation of the railroad, this is what we're counting on, this is what we're doing. No kind of subterfuge. He's facts, and like he's, got nothing to hide, he's speaking openly.
It's the scene because it's well lit, open space, direct questions, direct answers. It's complete, as William was saying, it's a complete inversion of what was at the top is the bottom and the bottom is the top.
Al? What?
When we talk about how the characters speak, I think we should also double back to the nasty characters at the bar. When I first read Atlas Shrugged years ago, I thought that the dialogue was unrealistic. People don't talk that way. What I think now is that she has the characters expressing what they believe, but in a more articulate fashion, in a stylized way. Not at all unrealistic, but it is stylized. And she's not the only author who does this. She perhaps does it the best. William Inge is another author that comes to mind who does that.
So you're saying both the dialogue at the top and at the bottom is stylized. This isn't how exactly how some crummy, covert businessman making a shady deal would talk, but it captures something about it, and likewise, Dagny and Eddie, it captures something about how straightforward people would talk. Harry says, reminds us that the roots of the railroad are in the bottom, which is another point made in the first chapter. So what is the significance of this idea that the top-like things are at the bottom and the bottom-like things are at the top? So is it just here's an interesting fact about how things are arranged spatially in this world?
Why is James Taggart, of all people, at the top? And why is Dagny and why is Eddie at the bottom, given everything we know about them?
And the only person that Eddie seems to be able to find that he could share a kind of kinship with, that he's so comfortable talking about his innermost feeling, is even more at the bottom. I mean, Dagny's second in charge at the railroad. Is the only guy Eddie can seem to find as a friend doesn't have much of a job, his clothes are greasy. And so who is at the top in this society and who's at the bottom? And Jim's at the top, it looks like. He can crowd people out at the table with his privilege. So there's a sense you might think that there's an inversion in the society. And maybe that's related to the larger problem.
I think that's the way William was describing it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And I think that brings us to the end of our time, if my clock is right. So that also brings about a tenth of the way through the novel. You're angling to say one more thing, though. So,
there are apparent contradictions, and we're in part one, which is non-contradiction. So I think there's a connection there as well.
You're raising a really good. So a lot of the things that we're noticing are tensions or contradictions or paradoxes. We talked about the significance of the title, the top and the bottom, making us think of who's at the top and who's at the bottom. The title of Chapter 2 made us think about who was enchained to whom. The title of Chapter 1 makes us think about what is the theme of this piece. And if we look at Part 1 as a whole, of which all these chapters are parts, or divisions, its title is non-contradiction. So we should be thinking that what we're finding in all of these parts is something about a contradiction that may be resolved later. And that's, I think, why a lot of what we need to be doing as we're reading these parts is noting questions, noting incongruities, looking for leads to an answer, but not expecting a whole answer to them to be in the story at this point. We expect them to come later. And with that, I think we can sign off.
Yeah, we'll see everybody next week. Same time, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, 11 p.m. Universal Time. You can find out more about the Atlas Project at atlasproject.live. And we'll be discussing Chapter 4, The Immovable Movers, next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.